In 2001, Hot 97 amplified the conflict by turning it into a highly publicized debate among listeners. When Jay-Z revealed his affair with the mother of Nas's child in his track, the radio executives didn't pull the plug. They put the controversy into heavy rotation. What the public romanticizes as the greatest rap battle in history was actually a toxic corporate blood market. While Nas had his private trauma stripped bare, and Jay-Z shattered his own street honor, the media ecosystem quickly monetized their conflict. Ultimately, the true kings of New York were not the rappers bleeding for the crown, but executives profiting from the controversy surrounding them. But before these two brilliant minds could be fed into the media's meat grinder, the arena itself had to be built. It was constructed upon a chilling vacuum of power. In March 1997, the notorious B.I.G. was gunned down in Los Angeles. His death was a catastrophic cultural trauma that left the throne of New York, the birthplace and capital of hip-hop, violently empty. In the late 1990s, holding that throne was not a matter of mere ego or street pride. It dictated radio syndication, international distribution deals, fashion lines, and multi-million-dollar endorsement contracts. The King of New York was a corporate CEO who operated with the cultural authority of a religious leader. Two men stood as the natural heirs to this vacant kingdom, but they represented entirely different, utterly incompatible philosophies of survival. Nas was the chosen one. Raised in the shadows of the Queensbridge housing projects, the largest public housing development in North America, he released his debut album Illmatic in 1994. It is still widely considered the greatest, most perfectly constructed hip-hop album ever recorded. Nas was a prodigy, a street reporter who documented the harsh, bloody realities of urban poverty with the literary grace of an old soul. He did not rap about wealth he did not have. He rapped about the view from his project window. But his brilliance was heavily burdened by expectation. As the 1990s progressed, Nas struggled to balance his artistic integrity with the ruthless demands of commercial viability. He adopted the Escobar Mafia persona, chasing radio hits with mixed success. By 2000, he was the reluctant king, increasingly withdrawn, observing the changing landscape from a distance, weighed down by the profound illness of his mother and his own internal artistic conflicts. Jay-Z, hailing from the Marcy Projects in Brooklyn, was the absolute antithesis. He did not possess Nas's early critical adoration, nor was he hailed as a teenage prodigy, but he possessed something arguably more dangerous in the music industry, a hyper-capitalist drive and a ruthless, calculating, strategic mind. Jay-Z approached the music business not as a starving artist, but as a hostile takeover specialist. When major labels rejected him, he and his partners built their own label, Rockefeller Records, selling CDs out of the boot of their cars. By 2001, he had released 5 albums in 5 years, transforming himself from a former street hustler into a polished, untouchable corporate don. He wanted the throne, and he realized that the only way to solidify his absolute monopolistic authority was to publicly break the man whom the streets still respected most. The tension between them had simmered for years, built on a foundation of subliminal insults, stolen samples, and perceived slights. Jay-Z had subtly tested the fences, dropping lines in his songs that questioned Nas's relevance. Nas, operating with the haughty pride of a seasoned veteran, usually ignored him or swatted the insults away with cryptic, dismissive verses. But Jay-Z recognized that subliminal warfare would not secure the crown. He needed a spectacle. He needed a public execution. And so he engineered the ambush at the 2001 Hot 97 Summer Jam. The choice of venue was not a coincidence. It was a demonstration of institutional power. Hot 97 was the undisputed gatekeeper of urban culture in America. What they played became a hit. Who they ignored disappeared. By launching his attack on their stage, Jay-Z was not just speaking to the crowd in the arena. He was broadcasting his declaration of war through the very nervous system of the music industry. When Jay-Z formally released the studio version of Takeover on his masterpiece album, The Blueprint, in September of that year, it was not a traditional rap diss track. It was a forensic boardroom-style audit of a man's life's work. Over a menacing driving beat built around a sample of The Doors, Jay-Z dissected Nas's entire discography with the cold precision of a prosecuting attorney. He attacked Nas's work ethic, his financial acumen, and his street credibility. He pointed out accurately and brutally that Nas had released one universally acclaimed classic album followed by a string of commercially inconsistent, critically divisive projects. 4 albums in 10 years I can divide, Jay-Z rapped, his voice dripping with condescension. That's one every, let's say 2. 2 of them shits was due. He mocked Nas for adapting his style to fit the trends, accusing him of moving from a conscious street poet to a fake Pablo Escobar, and finally to a confused veteran. He claimed that he, Jay-Z, had shown Nas his first TEC-9 submachine gun, stripping away the mythology of Nas's tough Queensbridge exterior. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, designed to make Nas look obsolete, lazy, and entirely irrelevant to the modern era. Jay-Z was telling the world, the old king is tired, his wealth is an illusion, and his pen has run dry. The media machine immediately recognized the gold mine they had been handed. The tragedy of the Nas and Jay-Z rivalry is that it occurred exactly at the moment when hip-hop media transitioned from a countercultural movement into a massive corporate enterprise. Hot 97 placed Takeover on heavy, relentless rotation. The DJs discussed it endlessly, dissecting the lyrics line by line. Print magazines like The Source and XXL cleared their editorial calendars to fan the flames, printing speculative articles and aggressive op-eds. For Nas, the pressure was suffocating, closing in on him from all sides. His personal life was fracturing. His mother, Ann Jones, the emotional anchor of his life, was battling severe breast cancer. The mother of his young daughter, Carmen Bryan, was increasingly estranged. And professionally, he was being written off by the very industry he had helped to build. The radio pundits, acting as the mouthpieces for the Rockefeller marketing machine, were gleefully broadcasting his professional obituary. The narrative was set. Jay-Z was the modern invincible billionaire in training, and Nas was a relic of the past, too slow and too broken to respond. The streets of New York held their breath. In the barber shops of Queens, the bodegas of Brooklyn, and the corporate offices of Manhattan, the question was the same. Will Nas respond? And more importantly, can he? To understand the weight of this moment, one must understand the absolute unforgiving nature of street honor. In this world, an unanswered insult is not a sign of maturity. It is a permanent brand of cowardice. If Nas remained silent, his legacy would be forever defined by Jay-Z's assessment of him. He would be remembered not as the genius who wrote Illmatic, but as the casualty who was crushed under the wheels of the Rockefeller machine. Jay-Z had backed him into a dark, desperate corner. But Jay-Z, for all his calculating brilliance, had made a fatal miscalculation. He had confused Nas's silence with weakness. He had forgotten that a wounded poet backed into a corner with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature in the arena. The corporate slickness of takeover was about to be met with a response so raw, so venomous, and so deeply personal that it would strip the polish right off Jay-Z's empire. The media had demanded blood, and Nas was preparing to deliver a slaughter. In the bitter chill of December 2001, the streets of New York were locked in a state of suspended animation. The terrorist attacks of September 11th had left the city fractured and mourning, but beneath the blanket of national grief, the underground pulse of the hip-hop ecosystem was beating with a frantic, bloodthirsty anticipation. Jay-Z's The Blueprint had dropped on the exact day the Twin Towers fell, and his surgical strike on Nas' takeover was dominating the airwaves. The industry had essentially written Nas's obituary. He was viewed as a brilliant relic, a poet who had lost his pen. The pressure resting on the shoulders of Nasir Jones was crushing. It was not just the weight of his career, it was the weight of his mother's failing health as she battled breast cancer, the fracturing of his personal life, and the collective stare of a city waiting to see if the King of Queensbridge would bow or bleed. When Nas finally stepped into the recording booth to answer, he did not bring the polished, radio-friendly Escobar persona that had alienated his core fan base. He brought the ghost of his younger self. He brought Nasty Nas, the hungry, desperate prodigy who had once watched the world from a project window. He did not seek to out-rap Jay-Z on a technical level, nor did he attempt to match the expensive, soulful production of Takeover. Nas understood something fundamental about street warfare that Jay-Z's corporate boardroom logic had missed. You do not win a knife fight with a spreadsheet. You win it by making the other man bleed so profusely that the crowd turns away in horror. The response was titled Ether. The word itself refers to a highly volatile, flammable liquid once used as an anesthetic, something that burns deeply and puts you to sleep. It was a fitting title for a track that would permanently alter the English lexicon. Ether did not open with a catchy hook or a slick introduction. It opened with the sound of gunfire, followed by a chopped, distorted voice chanting a blunt, profane dismissal of Jay-Z. Over a menacing, unpolished, almost chaotic beat produced by Ron Browse, Nas unleashed a psychological autopsy that systematically stripped away the billion-dollar mythology of Sean Carter. If Takeover was an audit of Nas's record sales, Ether was an assassination of Jay-Z's character. Nas bypassed the metrics of commercial success and aimed directly for the bedrock of hip-hop respect, authenticity. He painted Jay-Z not as a ruthless mob boss, but as a wealthy sycophant, a fan who had spent his youth carrying the bags of older, more respected rappers like Big Daddy Kane. He mocked Jay-Z's physical appearance, famously comparing his features to a camel. He accused him of being a cultural vampire, stealing the lyrical style of the late notorious B.I.G. and the tough guy persona of their peers. How much of Biggie's rhymes is gonna come out your fat lips? Nas sneered. But the most devastating blow was the accusation of spiritual emptiness. Nas framed Jay-Z as a man who had traded his soul for riches, a corporate construct entirely devoid of the gritty, poetic truth that defined real New York hip-hop. He questioned his masculinity, his street credibility, and his honor. It was a visceral, relentless, deeply disrespectful barrage that left no room for interpretation. Nas did not just beat Jay-Z, he humiliated him. He took the polished, untouchable CEO of Rockefeller Records and dragged him back down into the dirt of the projects, exposing the insecure hustler hiding behind the designer suits. The impact of Ether was seismic. It did not just leak, it erupted. Bootleg cassettes and CDs flooded the streets of the 5 boroughs before the official release of Nas's album Stillmatic. Cars driving down Fulton Street in Brooklyn and Queens Boulevard were vibrating with the sound of the track. The verdict from the streets was instantaneous and unanimous. The underdog had not just survived, he had decisively shifted public opinion in his favor. The aura of invincibility that Jay-Z had spent half a decade meticulously cultivating was shattered in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The term ether was immediately transformed into a verb. To ether, someone meant to completely humiliatingly destroy their reputation beyond repair. However, the true darkness of this rivalry does not lie in the brilliant, brutal poetry of the artists. It lies in the opportunistic, parasitic reaction of the corporate media system that surrounded them. In 2001, hip-hop radio and print media were transitioning into massive corporate entities. Stations like Hot 97 in New York were no longer just community broadcasters. They were multi-million-dollar businesses owned by corporate conglomerates like Emmys Communications. The executives in the corner offices recognized the Nas and Jay-Z feud not as a dangerous escalation between 2 proud, influential black men, but as the most lucrative marketing campaign of the decade. They did not attempt to diffuse the tension. They intensified the conflict to drive engagement and ratings. The radio DJs, who often positioned themselves as the cultural custodians of hip-hop, became the ringmasters of a brutal circus. Heavyweight personalities like Funkmaster Flex and Angie Martinez placed Takeover and Ether on back-to-back relentless rotation. They opened the phone lines, turning a deeply personal, increasingly toxic feud into a real-time public referendum. "Who is the king of New York?" the DJs would shout over the airwaves, urging listeners to call in and vote. Magazines like The Source and XXL printed inflammatory covers, parsing the lyrics and fanning the flames of division. They dispatched reporters to Queens and Brooklyn to interview associates, trying to dig up more dirt, more tension, more hatred. The entire culture was being monetized. The record labels, Rockefeller and Ill Will Records, backed by Columbia, pumped money into the narrative, seeing the direct correlation between the controversy and skyrocketing album sales. This is how the industry profits from conflict. The media executives, many of whom sat far removed from the violent realities of the streets, treated Nas and Jay-Z like prize fighters. But unlike professional boxing, where the physical damage ends when the bell rings, this battle was eroding the psychological and social standing of the participants 24 hours a day. The media was weaponizing the artists' pride, forcing them to constantly react to public opinion rather than their own artistic instincts. They had created an environment where stepping down or calling a truce was framed as ultimate cowardice. For Jay-Z, the situation was intolerable. He was a man who obsessed over control, a CEO who calculated every move to maximize his brand's value. Ether had introduced a variable he could not control: public mockery. For the first time since he had ascended to the top of the industry, the streets were laughing at him. The radio polls were heavily favoring Nas. The boardroom strategy of takeover had been entirely overwhelmed by the raw emotional truth of Ether. Jay-Z was bleeding in public, and the media sharks were circling, broadcasting his vulnerability every hour on the hour. The rules of engagement in street culture, while brutal, have distinct boundaries. You attack a man's credibility, his wealth, his crew, and his skills. But when a man feels his back pressed against the wall, when his ego is fractured and his empire is threatened, the unwritten rules begin to disintegrate. Jay-Z realized that he could not out-rap Ether. He could not win a battle of authenticity against the poet of Queensbridge. If he wanted to reclaim his absolute dominance, he had to inflict a wound so deep, so personal, and so humiliating that Nas would be unable to show his face in the city. Jay-Z looked past the recording studio. He looked past the streets. He looked directly into Nas's home. In the shadows of this public spectacle, a private betrayal had occurred. Carmen Bryan, the mother of Nas's young daughter, Destiny, had been carrying on a secretive, toxic affair with Jay-Z. It was a profound violation of trust, a deeply messy domestic situation that had been kept strictly behind closed doors. For years, Jay-Z had held on to this secret. It was the ultimate trump card, a piece of leverage so dark and damaging that using it would cross a line from which there was no return. But as the winter of 2001 set in, and the radio stations continued to play Ether to millions of cheering listeners, the polished CEO lost his composure. The corporate Don was replaced by a wounded, angry man seeking vengeance at any cost. Driven by the relentless prodding of the radio pundits and the unbearable sting of a bruised ego, Jay-Z decided to detonate the nuclear option. He was prepared to sacrifice his own honor, the privacy of a woman, and the psychological well-being of an innocent child just to win a radio poll. The stage was set for a broadcast that would cross every ethical boundary in the history of the music industry. The media machine, hungry for its next spike in ratings, eagerly awaited the tape. They did not care about the human cost. They only cared about the spectacle. And Jay-Z, blinded by pride, was about to hand them the most devastating, shameful piece of audio the city had ever heard. When the history of hip-hop is written, the winter of 2001 is rarely remembered for its music alone. It is remembered as the season the culture lost its innocence to the corporate blood market. The release of Ether had fundamentally altered the gravity of New York. Jay-Z, the untouchable architect of Rockefeller Records, the man who had meticulously constructed an aura of absolute invincibility, was suddenly bleeding in the public square. The streets had overwhelmingly crowned Nas the victor of the lyrical exchange. For a man whose entire empire was built on the projection of supreme dominance, this was not merely an artistic setback, it was an existential threat. Jay-Z was a conqueror, and conquerors do not tolerate humiliation. Driven into a corner by the raw poetic devastation of Ether, Jay-Z retreated into the recording studio. He was no longer operating with the cold, calculating boardroom logic that had birthed takeover. He was operating from a place of deeply wounded pride. He realized that he could not outright Nas. He could not reclaim the authentic street narrative from the boy who grew up in the Queensbridge projects. If he engaged Nas on the battlefield of lyrical skill and hip-hop purism, he would lose. To win, or at least to inflict an equal amount of agony, Jay-Z had to abandon the unwritten rules of engagement. He had to cross a boundary that, once breached, would forever stain his legacy. In the shadows of their public rivalry lay a deeply toxic private secret. Carmen Bryan, a woman who had been Nas's teenage sweetheart and the mother of his young daughter Destiny, had engaged in a clandestine affair with Jay-Z. It was a messy, painful domestic betrayal that had been fiercely guarded by those involved. In the hyper-masculine, fiercely territorial world of street culture, a man's family is the ultimate sanctuary. To violate that sanctuary is an act of supreme disrespect, but to broadcast that violation to the world is an act of absolute, unvarnished cruelty. Jay-Z decided to weaponize this secret. He recorded a devastating two-part freestyle titled Super Ugly. He opened the track spitting venom over Dr. Dre's Bad Intentions, a chilling preamble, before seamlessly transitioning into the instrumental of Nas's own hit, Got Self A. It was a deliberate, mocking theft designed to add absolute insult to the impending injury. If Takeover was a corporate audit, Super Ugly was a descent into the sewer. Jay-Z discarded metaphors and clever wordplay. Instead, he delivered a graphic, sneering, intimately detailed account of his sexual encounters with Carmen Bryan. He did not merely state that the affair had happened. He reveled in the humiliation of it. He boasted about sleeping with her in Nas's own luxury vehicles. He claimed to have left used condoms on the baby seat belonging to Nas's child. He aired the most humiliating private pain of a broken family with the gleeful cruelty of a schoolyard bully. But a recorded song is only a weapon if it has a delivery system. This is where the true villain of the narrative steps out from the shadows, the corporate media machine. Jay-Z did not quietly leak the track to the streets. He put the recording onto a cassette tape and had it rushed directly to the studios of Hot 97, the epicenter of New York's urban radio market. He handed it to DJ Angie Martinez, one of the most respected and influential voices in the city. At this precise moment, the executives and broadcasters at Hot 97 faced a profound ethical crossroads. They held in their hands a piece of audio that had no artistic merit. It was a targeted, malicious attempt to destroy a family, to humiliate a mother, and to drag an innocent child into a brutal public feud. A responsible journalistic entity, or even a community-minded broadcaster, would have recognized the catastrophic emotional damage the song would cause. They would have recognized that broadcasting it was a violation of basic human decency. The media did not hesitate. They did not flinch. They hit play. The broadcast of Super Ugly hit the airwaves of New York like a shockwave. As the explicit lyrics echoed out of car stereos, barbershop radios, and apartment windows across the 5 boroughs, the city collectively stopped. But the reaction was not the triumphant roar Jay-Z had anticipated. It was a sharp collective intake of breath. It was revulsion. The streets of New York, despite their reputation for grit and violence, are governed by a strict, unwritten constitution. The foundational law of this code is that women and children are strictly off limits in warfare. You attack a man's wealth, his crew, his skills, or his courage. You do not parade the mother of his child naked in front of the world. By crossing that line, Jay-Z instantly stripped himself of the mob boss persona he had spent years cultivating. Real mafiosos respect the sanctity of the family. Jay-Z looked like a desperate, bitter man who, unable to win a fair fight, had resorted to throwing acid in his opponent's face. Instead of cementing his dominance, Super Ugly exposed his fragility. The corporate Don had panicked. For Nas, the agony was unimaginable. He was forced to endure the profound humiliation of having his private trauma, his romantic betrayal, and his family's dysfunction broadcast to millions of strangers. He could not walk down the street, turn on the television, or listen to the radio without being confronted by the sound of his rival boasting about violating his home. It was a psychological torture designed to break a man's spirit completely, and the media gloried in his pain. The executives at MS Communications, the corporate owners of Hot 97, did not see a family being destroyed. They saw an unprecedented spike in Arbitron ratings. They saw advertising revenue soaring as listeners tuned in by the millions to hear the latest chapter of the blood sport. The station placed Super Ugly on heavy rotation, playing it back to back with ether, artificially keeping the wound open and bleeding. They opened the phone lines, inviting anonymous callers to laugh, mock, and pass judgment on Nas's domestic nightmare. Magazines rushed to print exclusive interviews, dissecting the affair, hounding Carmen Bryan, and plastering the faces of all involved across glossy covers. The industry had transformed Nas and Jay-Z into gladiators, but they had also dragged a mother and a child into the arena, letting the lions of public opinion tear them to pieces for the amusement of the spectators. The atmosphere in New York rapidly deteriorated from a thrilling musical rivalry to a deeply dangerous, volatile standoff. The mockery and the public humiliation had pushed the conflict past the point of lyrical resolution. When a man's family is publicly disrespected, the streets demand a physical response. The tension crackled in the air. Entourages grew larger. Security details were heavily armed. The clubs and industry parties became powder kegs, where a single wrong look or a misplaced word between the Rockefeller camp and the Ill Will camp could spark a bloodbath. The ghosts of Tupac Shakur and Christopher the Notorious B.I.G. Wallace suddenly loomed very large, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the city. Only 5 years earlier, the media had fanned the flames of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry, printing incendiary covers and encouraging the animosity until two of the greatest artists of their generation were shot dead in the streets. The industry had promised to learn from that tragedy, to never again let a lyrical dispute escalate into fatal violence. Yet, here they were, running the exact same playbook. The radio DJs and magazine editors who publicly mourned Biggie and Tupac were now gleefully pushing Nas and Jay-Z toward the same precipice. They wanted the danger. They wanted the edge, because danger sells records and tragedy generates legendary ratings. Nas, to his immense credit, maintained a stoic, almost terrifying silence in the immediate aftermath of Super Ugly. He did not rush to the radio to scream. He did not issue physical threats. But his silence was not capitulation. It was the silence of a man calculating a response that would have to transcend music. The disrespect was too deep to be answered with a rhyme. The public waited, holding its breath, expecting the news to break at any moment that shots had been fired outside a recording studio or nightclub. Jay-Z, meanwhile, was experiencing a profound backlash. The radio station polls, which had been the very metric he sought to manipulate, turned violently against him. The callers into Hot 97 expressed disgust. Even within his own camp, there was an uncomfortable murmur. The Rockefeller empire was built on looking cool, untouchable, and aspirational. Super ugly was none of those things. It was messy, it was dirty, and it was deeply dishonorable. The King of New York had thrown his crown into the mud to hit his enemy with a stone. The situation had spiraled completely out of the control of the artists and the executives. The media environment had pushed the boundaries of public discourse. A violent, tragic climax seemed not just possible but inevitable. The media had built the pyre, Jay-Z had lit the match, and Nas was standing in the flames. But the resolution to this crisis would not come from a drive-by shooting, nor would it come from a corporate boardroom. It would not be negotiated by high-priced lawyers or mediated by radio DJs looking for an exclusive scoop. The intervention that would halt the greatest rivalry in hip-hop history from ending in a morgue came from the most unexpected, deeply grounded source imaginable. It came from a place the corporate media could not control, and a voice that Sean Carter could not ignore. The ultimate reality check was about to be delivered not by a rival gangster, but by a mother listening to the radio in her kitchen, horrified by the monster her son had become. The morning after Super Ugly premiered on New York radio, the city woke up to an atmosphere that was thick, suffocating, and deeply uncomfortable. The media executives at Emmys Communications and the producers at Hot 97 were uncorking champagne. Their Arbitron ratings had skyrocketed. The phone lines were jammed with thousands of listeners, desperate to weigh in on the scandal. They had successfully turned the private sexual history and domestic trauma of two black artists into a citywide spectator sport. But down on the ground, away from the corporate boardrooms of Manhattan, the mood was vastly different. In the barbershops of Brooklyn, the bodegas of Queens, and the project courtyards across the 5 boroughs, the verdict was being handed down not by radio DJs, but by the people who actually dictated the culture. And their judgment was unanimous. Jay-Z had broken the code. Hip-hop, particularly the East Coast mafioso subgenre that Jay-Z had helped perfect, operates on a strict, unwritten constitution of masculinity and respect. You can target a rival's bank account, his criminal history, his lyrical ability, or his associates. But the mother of a man's child is a civilian. By dragging Carmen Bryan into the lyrical crossfire, and by explicitly boasting about leaving condoms in a car seat meant for Nas's young daughter, Jay-Z had crossed a sacred boundary. He did not look like the untouchable, ice-cold CEO of Rockefeller Records. He looked like a petty, wounded man who, unable to match the poetic devastation of Nas's ether, had resorted to throwing dirt. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of burying Nas, Super Ugly alienated Jay-Z's own base. The streets recoiled. The illusion of his absolute, unflappable control was shattered. He was bleeding, and in his desperation to stop the bleeding, he had inflicted a fatal wound on his own honor. The tension in the city escalated to a terrifying frequency. This was no longer just a battle on wax. When a man's family is publicly humiliated to this degree, the culture dictates that a physical response is mandatory. The entourages surrounding both camps grew larger and significantly more tense. The ghosts of the 1990s, the memory of how quickly the media fueled rivalry between Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. had devolved into fatal shootings, loomed over New York like a dark, heavy storm cloud. The radio stations and magazines, entirely insulated from the physical danger, continued to fan the flames, playing the tracks back to back, milking the threat of violence for every possible advertising dollar. But the intervention that would pull hip-hop back from the brink of another senseless tragedy did not come from a record executive, a heavily armed bodyguard, or a peacemaking politician. It came from a Brooklyn kitchen. Gloria Carter was not a part of the corporate music machine. She was a mother who had raised 4 children in the Marcy Projects, navigating the brutal realities of the 1970s and 80s drug epidemics to keep her family alive. She knew the cost of street violence. She knew how quickly a bruised ego could lead to a casket. When she turned on her radio and heard Super Ugly, she did not hear Jay-Z, the billionaire in training. She heard Sean, her son, making a catastrophic, shameful mistake. Gloria Carter picked up the telephone. The details of that phone call remain one of the most powerful, humanizing moments in the history of modern music. The exact words spoken between mother and son are private, but the dynamic is clear. The all-powerful CEO, the man who commanded a massive corporate empire and dictated the trends of global pop culture, was suddenly reduced to a scolded boy. Gloria did not mince words. She told him that his behavior was unacceptable. She told him that dragging a woman and a child into a rap battle was disgraceful, disrespectful to women, and beneath the dignity of the man she had raised. She did not suggest that he reconsider his tactics. She demanded that he fix it. She ordered him to publicly apologize. For Jay-Z, this was an unimaginable pill to swallow. In the hyper-masculine arena of battle rap, an apology is synonymous with surrender. It is an admission of weakness, a televised waving of the white flag. To apologize to Nas, the very man he was trying to destroy, meant completely abandoning the takeover narrative. It meant acknowledging that Ether had hurt him so badly he had lost his mind. But Gloria Carter's authority superseded the laws of hip-hop. In December 2001, just days after Super Ugly had set the city on fire, Jay-Z made the long walk into the studios of Hot 97. He sat down across from DJ Angie Martinez. The swagger, the arrogant tilt of the chin, the polished Rockefeller confidence, all of it was gone. He looked exhausted, humbled, and deeply uncomfortable. When he spoke into the microphone, his voice was stripped of its usual bravado. It was a profoundly jarring moment for millions of listeners who had tuned in expecting another round of lyrical warfare. "I want to apologize to Carmen," Jay-Z said, his words echoing across the city. "I want to apologize to my mom, and I want to apologize to Nas's family." He admitted live on air that his emotions had gotten the better of him. He confessed that the intense pressure of the feud, the constant prodding from the media, and his own wounded pride had pushed him to record something he deeply regretted. He owned his mistake completely. The apology was a shockwave of a different kind. It effectively ended the active, hostile phase of the rivalry. The threat of immediate physical violence evaporated the moment Jay-Z swallowed his pride. It was a remarkable display of maturity, but it was also a devastating public defeat. The media machine, which had happily monetized the cruelty of Super Ugly, now happily monetized the contrition. They replayed the apology endlessly, dissecting his tone, analyzing his body language, and squeezing the last drops of drama from his humiliation. With Jay-Z's surrender, Hot 97 officially closed their listener polls. They announced the results live on air. The public had spoken. Nas had won. He was officially crowned the victor of the greatest battle in hip-hop history. Ether had triumphed over takeover. The King of Queensbridge had successfully defended his throne against the ultimate corporate hostile takeover. But as the dust settled and the radio stations moved on to their next manufactured drama, the reality of Nas's victory began to set in. It was a victory, yes, but it was profoundly, bitterly hollow. Nas had retained his title, but at what cost? He had been forced to endure the agony of having his most private domestic pain aired out for the amusement of the world. The mother of his child had been publicly branded and humiliated. His daughter's name had been dragged through the mud. The corporate entities that crowned him. The winner had done nothing to protect him when he was bleeding. They had only handed him a trophy after they had finished selling tickets to his public flaying. There was no joy in Queensbridge that night. There was only a cold, exhausting relief that the circus was over. Nas had proven his poetic supremacy, but the battle had left deep, permanent scars on his personal life. He realized that the dominant position in New York hip-hop, the title he had fought so viciously to protect, was just a chair sitting in the middle of a slaughterhouse. This is the ultimate tragedy of the blood market. The rappers, for all their wealth, lyrical genius, and cultural influence, were ultimately just collateral damage. The media executives, the unseen men and women who tracked Arbitron ratings and sold advertising space, were the only true victors. They did not write the rhymes. They did not risk their lives on the streets. And they did not have their families humiliated on the radio. They simply provided the arena, handed out the swords, and collected the money at the door. Jay-Z walked away from the battle with his corporate empire intact, but his reputation as an untouchable lyrical god was permanently fractured. He had shown the world that he could bleed, that he could panic, and that he could lose. Nas walked away with the crown, but he had to sacrifice his privacy and his peace of mind to keep it. The culture had survived, but it had been deeply compromised. The industry had proven that there was no line it would not cross, no family it would not exploit, and no boundary it would respect in the pursuit of profit. The battle between Nas and Jay-Z became the definitive blueprint for modern media exploitation. It taught the corporate overlords of hip-hop a terrifying lesson. The public will pay top dollar to watch their heroes bleed, and if you press the right buttons, the heroes will gladly cut themselves. The immediate danger had passed, but the air in New York remained heavy. The two greatest artists of their generation had been pushed to the absolute limit, manipulated into tearing each other apart for sport. They had both survived the arena, but the psychological and emotional toll of the war would take years to process. The Hot 97 apology was the end of the war, but it was not the end of the story. The silence that followed the battle was not peaceful. It was the deafening silence of a battlefield after the artillery had stopped firing. Nas and Jay-Z retreated to their respective corners, nursing their wounds, separated by a chasm of bitterness and mistrust. The media moved on, searching for fresh meat, leaving the two legends to deal with the real-world consequences of their radio-manufactured hatred. It would take years of reflection, growth, and a fundamental shift in the landscape of hip-hop before these two men could even look each other in the eye again. The crown of New York had been secured, but both men were about to learn that ruling a kingdom built on media manipulation is the loneliest job in the world. The silence that followed Jay-Z's apology on Hot 97 was not the peaceful quiet of a resolved conflict. It was the exhausted, heavy stillness of a battlefield after the artillery has ceased firing. The immediate danger of physical violence had been averted by the uncompromising moral authority of a mother, but the psychological wreckage left in the wake of the feud was immense. Nas and Jay-Z retreated to their respective corners of New York, separated by a chasm of bitterness, public humiliation, and profound mistrust. The corporate media machine, having extracted every possible drop of advertising revenue and ratings from their mutual degradation, simply packed up its microphones and moved on, scanning the horizon for the next two young black men willing to tear each other apart for sport. In the years immediately following 2001, the divergent paths of both men revealed the deep, invisible scars of the arena. Nas had won the battle in the eyes of the public, retaining his title as the poetic soul of Queensbridge, but the victory brought no joy. In April 2002, just months after the dust of ether had settled, his mother, Ann Jones, succumbed to breast cancer. She had been the emotional anchor of his life, his protector, and his guiding light. To lose her while still carrying the fresh, ugly wounds of his family's public humiliation was a staggering blow. Nas channeled this profound grief into his next album, God's Son. It was a raw, deeply introspective project that entirely discarded the mafioso bravado of the late 1990s. He was no longer interested in defending a mythical throne. He was a man in mourning, trying to piece together his fractured spirit. On tracks like Dance, he wept openly for his mother, presenting a vulnerability that stood in stark defiance of the hyper-masculine, emotionless posturing the radio stations demanded. He had survived the blood market, but he had learned a bitter lesson. The crown of New York was made of thorns, and the people who cheered the loudest for the king were the first to demand his execution. Jay-Z conversely threw himself into the pursuit of absolute corporate invincibility. The humiliation of Super Ugly and the forced public apology had fractured his aura, but he possessed a uniquely ruthless capacity for compartmentalization. If he could not win the undisputed respect of the streets, he would simply buy the building that housed them. He released a string of massively successful albums, expanding his Rockefeller empire into clothing, vodka, and sports management. In 2003, he released the Black Album and announced his retirement from rapping, staging a magnificent sold-out farewell concert at Madison Square Garden. He was transitioning from a gladiator into an emperor. By 2004, he was named the president and CEO of Def Jam Recordings, the most powerful hip-hop record label in the world. He now wore bespoke suits, sat in boardrooms with billionaire investors, and dictated the global terms of urban music. Yet, despite their parallel successes, the unresolved tension between them remained the elephant in the room of American pop culture. They were the two most important figures in their genre, living and working in the same city, yet they existed in a state of permanent, icy estrangement. The media had not forgotten, Every interview, every retrospective article, and every radio segment inevitably circled back to the feud. The industry had learned the wrong lesson from 2001. Rather than recognizing the danger of weaponizing personal trauma, the corporate overlords saw a highly lucrative business model. They began manufacturing and promoting new rivalries, actively encouraging artists like 50 Cent and Ja Rule to engage in increasingly dangerous, deeply personal public warfare. The blood market was booming, and Nas and Jay-Z were the architects of its most profitable blueprint. By the autumn of 2005, the culture was choking on its own toxicity. The constant demand for beef and confrontation had exhausted the fans and endangered the artists. It was in this climate that Jay-Z, now the ultimate corporate insider, announced a concert at the Continental Airlines Arena in New Jersey. He titled the event, "I Declare War." The media immediately snapped to attention. The title alone was a dog whistle to the blood market. The magazines and radio stations whipped themselves into a frenzy, speculating about who Jay-Z was preparing to annihilate. Would he go after new rivals? Would he reopen the wounds with old enemies? The executives prepared for a ratings bonanza. They bought into the narrative that the corporate Don was returning to the arena to settle scores and reassert his dominance through lyrical violence. 30,000 people bought tickets, expecting a massacre. On the night of October 27, 2005, the arena was vibrating with a tense, almost feral anticipation. Jay-Z took the stage, commanding the crowd with the effortless authority he had spent a decade perfecting. The audience waited for the venom. They waited for the projected photographs and the targeted insults. Instead, Jay-Z stopped the music. He looked out over the sea of faces, the very people who had cheered for his destruction 4 years prior, and he spoke. "I declare war," he said, pausing as the crowd roared, hungry for blood. "I declare war on the system. I declare war on the people who want to see us tear each other down." He signaled to the DJ. The familiar haunting piano loop of his classic 1996 track, "Dead Presidents," began to play. It was a deeply symbolic choice. The chorus of "Dead Presidents" featured a vocal sample scratched directly from a Nas song. It was the very sample that had sparked their initial quiet resentment almost a decade earlier. Jay-Z looked toward the side of the stage. "All that beef shit is done," he announced. From the shadows, Nasir Jones walked out into the light. The sound that erupted from the Continental Airlines Arena in that moment was not a roar. It was a sonic boom. It was the sound of 30,000 people experiencing absolute, unadulterated shock, followed immediately by a euphoric, historic realization. The two greatest rivals in the history of the culture, the men who had eviscerated each other's families, careers, and honor for the amusement of the world, were standing shoulder to shoulder. They clasped hands. They embraced. The hostility that had poisoned New York for half a decade dissolved in a matter of seconds. Together they performed "Dead Presidents" and NASA's anthem, "The World Is Yours," seamlessly trading verses, their voices intertwining with the natural chemistry of two men who had grown up breathing the exact same air. This was not just a concert moment. It was a profound act of rebellion. By shaking hands on that stage, Nas and Jay-Z executed the ultimate subversion of the corporate media machine. They did not give the radio stations a new feud to monetize. They did not give the magazines a new scandal to print. They took the power back. They demonstrated in real time that two black men operating at the highest echelons of power could choose unity over mutual destruction. They exposed the "I Declare War" title as a brilliant, deliberate bait and switch, mocking the media's desperate thirst for violence. The executives who had sold tickets to a gladiator match were forced to watch a peace treaty. The reconciliation of Nas and Jay-Z fundamentally altered the trajectory of modern hip-hop. It was a mature, sobering acknowledgement that the throne they had fought so viciously over was an illusion, a wooden chair painted gold by radio programmers to keep the talent divided and easily controlled. They realized that their true power did not lie in destroying each other, but in combining their massive cultural capital to build something the system could not touch. The aftermath of that handshake was a masterclass in collective economic power. Shortly after the concert, Nas, effectively ending his contract with Columbia Records, signed a multi-million-dollar deal with Def Jam Recordings. He was now officially signed to a label where his former mortal enemy was the president and CEO. It was a business move that baffled the purists, but demonstrated a profound cold-blooded maturity. The two men, who had once tried to end each other's careers, were now legally bound in a partnership designed to generate immense wealth for both of them. In 2006, Nas released his Def Jam debut, provocatively titled "Hip Hop Is Dead." On it, he featured a track called "Black Republican," the first official in-studio collaboration between him and Jay-Z. Over a sweeping cinematic orchestral beat, they did not rap about their past grievances. They rapped about wealth, survival, and the strange solitary burden of being the last men standing from an era that had killed so many of their peers. It was the sound of two veterans who had walked through the fire, looked at the burns on each other's skin, and decided that they had both shed enough blood for the entertainment of strangers. Today, the 2001 feud between Nas and Jay-Z is studied not just as a musical event, but as a historical text. It remains the gold standard of lyrical warfare, the benchmark against which every subsequent artistic rivalry is measured. But to look back on Ether and Takeover strictly as a celebration of wordplay is to miss the profound, chilling warning embedded in the narrative. Their story is a harsh, unflinching mirror held up to the entertainment industry and the society that consumes its products. It exposes the voyeuristic, parasitic nature of a media ecosystem that treats human dignity as a disposable commodity. When the executives at Hot 97 put a family's trauma to a public vote, they were not serving the culture, they were strip mining it. They relied on the hyper-masculine pride of two young men from the projects, knowing that the fear of looking weak would force them to keep stabbing each other long after the initial anger had faded. The survival of Nas and Jay-Z is a testament to their extraordinary intellectual resilience. They are the exception, not the rule. In an industry that has routinely watched its brightest stars die in the crossfire of manufactured hatred, these two men managed to step back from the precipice. Today, Jay-Z is a billionaire, a global titan of industry, whose influence stretches far beyond the confines of music. Nas has evolved into a highly respected elder statesman, a tech investor, and a Grammy-winning artist who continues to release critically acclaimed work on his own independent terms. They have both transcended the narrow, suffocating definitions of success that the industry tried to force upon them in 2001. They survived because they eventually recognized the true nature of the arena. They saw the luxury boxes. They saw the men counting the money while they bled on the dirt. The throne of New York, it turned out, was never a physical seat to be conquered. It was a psychological trap, designed to keep brilliant minds fighting over scraps while the owners of the architecture walked away with the feast. The clash between Nas and Jay-Z began as a battle for supremacy, but it ended as a profound lesson in liberation. When we look back at the summer of 2001, we should not just hear the roar of the crowd at Summer Jam or the stinging, venomous syllables of ether. We should hear the terrible mechanical hum of the corporate machine grinding the pride of two legends into dust. The true victory in the greatest rivalry in musical history was not a song. It was not a radio poll. The true victory was the handshake. It was the moment two men looked at the weapons they had been handed, dropped them on the stage, and walked out of the arena alive. They proved that the ultimate display of power is not the ability to destroy an enemy, but the courage to forgive a brother in a world that profits from your war.